Now, we're delighted to have as our speaker at this meeting, coming to us this evening in this new world of ours from Toronto, Rachel Jacobs. Rachel has worked at Waddesdon Manor for the past 10 years, first as an assistant curator and since 2015 as curator of books. She's got a particular interest in 17th and 18th century French prints, books and bindings, and has curated a number of exhibitions at Waddesdon, including Glorious Years, French calendars from Louis XIV to the Revolution, that was in 2017 to 18. And before that, an exhibition Persuading the King, a manuscript petition by Gabriel de Saint-Aubin, 1724 to 1780. And before that, Royal Spectacle, ceremonials and festivities at the Court of France, which was curated with Selma Schwartz, as well as playing, learning, flirting, printed board games from 18th century France, an exhibition of 2012. In 2020, she published a book for Lord Rothschild about his country house, Eythrob, which covered its history and its collection. And Rachel is currently working on an exhibition, Books of Art, from Artists to Art History in the Age of Enlightenment, an exhibition which has been delayed, alas, owing to pandemic, but will be available digitally this summer. And she was also awarded, although that's also been delayed because of the pandemic, the Grolier Club Library, the Grolier Club Library William H. Helfand Fellowship for 2020, in which she hopes to study Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild's collection of albums of prints and drawings from the records of the Librairie Damascene Morgande. She's indeed giving us tonight an overview of the Waddesdon collection of printed books, manuscripts, and book bindings. So it's with enormous pleasure that I ask Rachel Jacobs to speak to us on Waddesdon Manor, a Rothschild collection. Rachel.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Okay. Oops. Right. Okay. Is that okay? Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yes. Okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the Bibliographical Society for giving me a chance to speak to you today. And also thank you to all of you who are Zooming in and listening. I know many of you know this collection very well. So for those of you, I hope it's a nice kind of reminder and seeing some old friends. And for others, I hope to be able to introduce you to some of its treasures. The Waddesdon collection, formed by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, is known for its 18th century riches in terms of exquisite bindings, often with illustrious provenances and associations. And here's just a little taster of a few of those that we will look at a little bit later. I'm going to start today by introducing you to Ferdinand as a collector and as a reader, and I also want to touch on his working library. I then want to move the story forward and just touch on the other figures in the Waddesdon history who've contributed to its collections, Alice, James and Dorothy, and then we can finish with Lord Rothschild and some of the more recent loans that have come in to the collection. I could not give you this talk today without the incredible 2-volume catalogue of printed books and book bindings by Giles Barber, published in 2013, started by Graham Pollard, and all of the other wonderful scholars, librarians, curators, conservators, and specialists who've come before me and contributed to the knowledge and understanding of this collection. And I wanted to thank Rosamund Griffin as well, who was in the final edits of the Barber catalogue when I started at Waddesdon 10 years ago and who introduced me to this wonderful collection. Okay, so here we go. The Rothschilds established themselves as a pan-European banking dynasty with its founder Mayer Amschel and his wife Gutel Schnapper in the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto in the late 18th century. Their 5 sons, seen here on the right, were sent to the financial centers of Europe, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, to establish their own branches of the family business. Baron Ferdinand, who you can see here lounging with a book on the left, was born in 1839, the younger son of Baron Anselm of the Viennese branch and Charlotte of the English branch of the family. And you can see a painting there of his parents on the right. He was born in Paris, but grew up in Frankfurt and Vienna. Ferdinand was of the generation that did not need to commit themselves to the family business. He was far more interested in art and history and politics, later becoming the Liberal MP for Aylesbury. He moved to England in 1860. Here's another portrait of him, and described it as the land of my dreams. He purchased a London house on Piccadilly, and he married his cousin Evelina, who you can see here on the right, in 1865, the daughter of Lionel and Charlotte de Rothschild. Tragically, after only 18 months of marriage, Evelina and their baby died in childbirth. Ferdinand never remarried, but his youngest sister Alice became a lifelong companion and an important figure in the history of Waddesdon. By the time Ferdinand came into his inheritance in 1874, after the death of his father, the Rothschilds had already established themselves in Buckinghamshire, building country houses at Aston Clinton, Halton, Mentmore, and Tring, all within a few miles of each other. And in that same year, the Duke of Marlborough put up on the market his estate at Winchenden in Buckinghamshire, which Ferdinand quickly purchased. And here you can see the barren land that was the estate before he started building. He hired the architect and great bibliophile Gabriel Hippolyte Détaillard, who we can see here in the middle of this slide. And Détaillard's expertise in earlier French architectural styles, including the French Renaissance, was perfect for Ferdinand, who wanted to build a manor inspired by the great chateau of the Valois kings. And you can see here on the right some of the inspirations for Waddesdon, Chambord on the top and Blois on the bottom. And I wanted to include on the left this lovely photograph of Ferdinand dressed as a Renaissance prince for the Devonshire House Ball in 1897. So built as a country retreat to be enjoyed by guests in the summer months, where they would not only enjoy the collection and the grand interiors, but also the landscape and garden designed by Monsieur Lenny, and the glass houses, the aviary of tropical birds, the dairy, and the daytime pavilion built by Alice. Here, is the final plan of Waddesdon, just to give you an overview. It went through many different plans along the way, but this was the final one. And here's an image of building Waddesdon, and on the bottom right, you can see the Prince of Wales in the foreground, future Edward VII, playing a game of tennis on the north front of the manor with some tents there, people enjoying tea. The interior of Waddesdon Manor in its decoration context is a fine example of the Rothschild with its combination of the French 18th century decorative arts, boiserie and textiles, and British 18th century paintings. The whole, except for the Renaissance-inspired bachelor's wing, is an imagined 18th century interior combined with the modern comforts of the 19th century. So here on the left, you have the red drawing room, which is the first main reception room that you enter at Waddesdon, and then on the right, the grey drawing room. So I'll leave it on that slide. Despite having inherited and collected a total of 14 illuminated manuscripts from his father, which he eventually bequeathed to the British Museum as part of his Waddesdon bequest, he was not initially interested in collecting books, and his apparent lack of books at Waddesdon was criticized by Mary Gladstone, the Prime Minister's youngest daughter, after she visited in 1885, when she commented that pictures in his sitting room are too beautiful, but there isn't a book in the house save 20 improper French novels. This observation seems to be contradicted by Ferdinand himself when he wrote a few years later in the periodical The 19th Century in 1888, "If French books are to be read, it is manifestly desirable that we should read those which have at any rate the merit of conveying historical instruction as well as entertainment." In this comment, Ferdinand may have been playing more to his audience than speaking the truth about his own reading. The surviving letters we have to members of his family and his dear and intimate friends, the 5th Earl of Rosebery, who had married his cousin Hannah, reveal an avid reader of all sorts, including many French novels. Some may be considered improper. His letters to Rosebery, or Lattice as he calls him, often mention books he's reading. Also, he's repeatedly asked for English book suggestions. Ferdinand also offers up opinions and critiques of Rosebery's speeches and sends him samples of his own writing in return. Here's an image of both Rosebery and Ferdinand on the right. And here's one of Rosebery's own works, for example, a list of persons concerned in the rebellion of 1745, printed in 1890 with a dedication to Ferdinand. Unfortunately, the letters that survive don't discuss any of their own collecting, even though they had many shared interests. And Barber points out that there's some 60 titles which are present in both of their collections. Ferdinand describes his own early reading habits in his unpublished memoirs, Reminiscences of 1897. And I just wanted to read you this evocative passage. He says, "As soon as I was able to read, I devoured books with insatiable voracity, fairy tales first, then romances and novels. Hoffman's tales and others of a similar kind increased the nervousness and dreaminess of my disposition, which lasted until I was well on in my teens. I fully believe that a narrow white passage which led from the nursery to the schoolroom was tenanted by fairies, and that the ghosts of the dead hovered over their graves in the churchyards." So that's a little insight into Ferdinand's early reading. So I wanted to start with looking at the small library, or what we consider his working library. The photographs here from his Red Book, which was a privately published album of photographs and an account of his building of Waddesdon, shows that the small library, which was home to some of his working library or contemporary works, included 2 inset bookcases on either side of the fireplace, and then here you can see more clearly, and 2 large and 4 smaller freestanding bookcases. Unfortunately, these freestanding bookcases are no longer in the room, and what remains today, oh, there's a detail, some lovely mice and animals on top. So what remains today are some 680 volumes, for the most part published between the 1820s and 1900, with a few exceptions. None of these books were included in the printed catalogue and have yet to be properly catalogued on our database. I've counted some 126 titles in German, mostly literature, poetry, or philosophy and theory. The rest of the titles are in French and English. The genres overall cover history, biography, and memoirs, which were some of Ferdinand's favorite readings, poetry, literature, literary criticism, political history, art history, philosophy, travel, archaeology, and science. It's interesting to note here that where he's lacking in some of the literary classics in his 18th century library, here he makes up for them with some of the titles in 19th century editions. There are quite a few dedicated copies in the small library. For example, an interesting one from Schliemann, here on the bottom left, dedicates his Troy and its remains to the Baron Ferdinand and his sister. This volume is presented with the respects of the author Schliemann, London, 5th of July, 1875. This is an interesting point which highlights possibly the fact that the working library was for both Alice and Ferdinand. Alice joined him as a sort of co-host at Waddesdon and had her own bedroom there. So she very much lived at Waddesdon as well. And also I wanted to point out on the right there, which is there are at least two inscribed books from the American opera singer turned writer journalist Blanche Roosevelt, who was also a mistress of Guy de Maupassant, who also visited Waddesdon on a number of occasions. And I kind of like to think of her as Ferdinand. Ferdinand might have enjoyed this character in amongst his manor filled with his 18th century portraits of the great actresses, Mrs. Abingdon and Mrs. Robinson, for example. Okay, so despite having a working library and a clear love of books and literature, Ferdinand did not start actively collecting rare books until the late 1880s, around the same time that he started to build an extension at Waddesdon, which came to be known as the Morning Room, completed between 1889 and 1891. Earlier plans for this extension were titled Projet de Bibliothèque, which you can see here, but the idea of a full library space was abandoned for a more versatile one. Here to the right is the extension, which is now the morning room and was a bedroom suite above. And again, images from the 1897 Red Book of the morning room. So earlier plans for a full library space was abandoned for a more versatile one with 5 low freestanding bookcases with room above to hang his collection of mostly 17th century Dutch and Flemish paintings, along with some 18th century portraits. In the Red Book, Ferdinand described this room as more of a hall-like space, which would allow his friends to meet and read and write without disturbing each other, so not expressly a library as such. Here's another view of the morning room. And this general layout of the room was also favored by some other members of his family. And I just show you here quickly at Halton, which was the alterations completed by Alfred in 1883. And you can see here very similar with, again, Dutch and Flemish paintings above. And then at 41 Faubourg Saint-Honoré, with Edmond's collection of works and paper, you can see his portfolios there in, again, similar bookcases. And I show you just a few images from today. I hope one day to be able to welcome you all back at Waddesdon, but for now, we'll just have to enjoy some of the photographs details here. In the morning room, a couple of paintings resonate quite well with the books. Hanging above the fireplace to the left here is a portrait of Thais by Joshua Reynolds from 1781. Who was the courtesan who accompanied Alexander the Great on his campaign when he conquered Persia. She's thought to have persuaded him to set fire to the palace and the library of Persepolis, and you can see the flames burning of this library burning in the bottom right. And another significant painting in the room is the portrait of the young Alexander, 10th Duke of Hamilton, 1786, by Gainsborough, depicted in Van Dyck Renaissance-style dress. And of course, the 10th Duke was an avid collector himself, but more importantly, through his marriage to the daughter of William Beckford, inherited a vast part of the Beckford collection. Today, 26 books in the morning room came from the Beckford Library, and then a further 6 from the Duke's own acquisitions. And both of these paintings were acquired when the morning room was being built, so very much with the intention of placing them in and amongst his books. In a recently acquired Waddesdon household book from 1887 to 1891, so exactly the period that he starts collecting and building the extension, I was able to find the book dealer, Mr. F. Wheeler, who visited Waddesdon on 5 separate occasions between 1889 and 1891. Barbara suggests that Mr. Wheeler may have assisted with the compilation of the Baron's catalogue of French books from 1897, due to 2 installments of quite large payments. Ferdinand requested that all of his personal papers be destroyed after his death. So we have very little at Waddesdon that survives, but from what does survive, Barbara's outline that we can see in the catalogue, we can see that payments made to London booksellers begin really in 1889 to Pearson, Quaritch, Wheeler, Tuvey, Robson, Grisbrook, Brown, Hatchard, and Bumbus. And for his Parisian booksellers, the most significant purchases are made to Morgan et Fatou, with smaller payments made to Achille, Duchesne, Baudouin, and Legault. And the Morgan stock books for 1887 and 1888, which are in the Grolier Club, reveal only 3 entries from the acquisitions, but this for 1887 to 1889, reveal only 3 entries for acquisitions, but his purchasing increases year on year from 1889 to his death in 1898. And of course, this was a rich period for book collectors. The second half of the 19th century was, of course, fruitful in terms of sales, but also major studies in the field were also being published at the same time in the 1880s. Ferdinand's unpublished memoirs provide an indication of the type of collector he was aspiring to be. In his discussion of Lord Hertford and the Duc d'Aumale, whose collections had recently been gifted to their respective nations, becoming Wallace Collection and Chantilly, the main distinction he makes between the two is based on their collections of books. He writes, "No exception can be taken to the refinement of Lord Hertford's taste, but the Duc d'Aumale was a refined mind, and the mind of a scholar to boot. The only books that Lord Hertford bequeathed to Sir Richard Wallace were of a style that shall be nameless, and he at once consigned them to oblivion. The Duc d'Aumale founded a library than which there is no more complete, more interesting, or more valuable extant." The Duc d'Aumale, who visited Waddesdon on a number of occasions, was undoubtedly a model collector for Ferdinand, who in his own literary and scholarly pursuits may have been trying to prove himself as this type of scholar collector. Ferdinand published a number of articles on art and history in various periodicals and self-published a number of books, including Personal Characteristics from French History and his series of village lectures, which he gave between 1884 and 1888. In one of his lectures, titled Desultory Discourses in 1886, he provides a brief history of the book through the Middle Ages to the advent of printing. And he also includes a touching personal anecdote where he describes the reverence he felt when he was given the chance to turn the pages of the Doomsday Book. Alongside his village lectures, Ferdinand wrote a travel memoir, which we can see here, 3 Weeks in South Africa, printed in 1895, for which he received a raving review from Sir Arthur Peel in a letter to Ferdinand, and also 2 works of fiction, in German, Veroni Novelli from 1878, and here, The Legend of Samandal from 1885. I just want to read you the introduction here before we get into his shelves. He writes, "On dusting the shelves of my library, I discovered in a hidden recess an ancient and moldy manuscript. How and when it found its way there, I cannot tell, nor care to investigate. After deciphering it and rendering it somewhat oriental exaggeration in more homely phraseology, it struck me that its contents might be acceptable to the English reader." And so from Ferdinand's imagined dusty shelves, let's now look at the hopefully dust-free shelves of the morning room and explore some of its treasures. The 5 bookcases hold some 800 volumes. The titles date predominantly from the later 17th century and 18th centuries, with the earliest, this copy of Champier les Grands Chroniques, printed in Paris, 1516, in a binding of around 1720 with the arms of Prince Eugène de Savoie. Parisian imprints represent 56% of the collection, with London covering 32%. Barbara suggests that most of the books were acquired for their visual appeal, either external and internal, and for their provenance and association. The collection is wide-ranging, but does not cover everything that one might expect in the late 19th century gentleman's library, with almost no theology, philosophy, jurisprudence, medicine, mathematics, or physics. And Barbara introduces the collection in a really helpful way in grouping certain themes that we can see. And I just wanted to read these out to you to give you an overview. So he groups them in history, voyages, travel, and exploration, and then state occasions, theater, and social life, persecution, torture, lawbreakers, topography and architecture, calligraphy and typography, art, horses and horsemanship, and literature. So, the year before his death, Ferdinand published his catalogue of French books, which was shown as tome premier, so it might indicate that he was hoping to continue with the catalogue series. And it contained 21 color plates of bindings with a strong preference for mosaics. So as we dive into the collection, I wanted to start by showing you a nice group of our mosaic bindings, including the 4 Giordano Bruno books published in London in the 16th century, but bound in Paris in the 1720s for the Count d'Oym by Antoine Michel Padeloup le Jeune. So those are some of our beautiful à répétition style mosaics. And then we'll look a little bit closer at this wonderful volume, which is Longus Les Amours Pastorales de Daphne Chloé, published in Paris in 1718. And this is, of course, a book that became a cult classic in the 18th century with numerous editions and finally bound copies. And Waddesdon has quite a few of them as well. And also associated with the regent, the Duc d'Orléans, Philippe II, with the plate signed by the regent. You can see there, Philippus invent epixit 1714, but probably most likely the hand of Coipel. There are 28 plates by Audran after the Duc d'Orléans or Coipel. And of course, this is one of the 3 copies with the arms of the Duke of the Regent, and the other 2, one, the locations are known, and the other at the Wormsley Library. And it's just a wonderful, beautiful binding attributed. Barbara discusses the attribution in great deal in the catalogue, settles on Augustin du Seuil, but also questions the Padeloup involvement with the whirling wheel treatment on the spine. So that's now moving on. We have this wonderful floral mosaic binding for Bandello's Novelli, and there are 4 volumes, all different sizes. So it's quite wonderful to see how the spine treatment is uniform and harmonious across different sized books on the shelves. So this is Bandello, of course, the 16th century work, but printed in London by S. Harding in 1740. And the bindings date from just after 1742, which were the date of the end leaves. Bound by Louis-François Le Monnier, and he stamps each cover twice. And there's a detail there on the stem on the right where you can see Monnier. And also, I'm sorry, I don't have an image of the other stamp palette, which is at the very bottom in the middle along the edge of the border. And it says Monnier Fessy. And there's another book with an almost identical binding for a work on Boccaccio, which was also in the same sale of Louis-Jean Guégan, the sale of 1769. And that book was acquired by the Duc d'Aumale and now at Chantilly. So this is some of our beautiful mosaic treasures. And then moving along, we have this lovely a book with the arms of Marie Antoinette of the royal couple, which is a book which celebrates a fête given by the Duchesse de Mazarin at Chilly, near Paris, to celebrate the marriage of the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette. And it has this wonderful mosaic binding, which also includes little dolphin tools and eagles and clasped hands on the cover, and attributed to Andy de Rome based on the wonderful doublure. And you can see the watered silk there. It's just incredible. And then on the right, you've got the title page. It's a pen facsimile signed Few. And it describes the events of this celebration. The Gazette de France records the event as Monseigneur le Dauphin, Madame la Dauphine et Mesdames alleront souper à Chilly le 13 de ce mois chez la Duchesse de Mazarin, qui leur donnera une très belle fête. Doesn't include the très beau livre that must have then been given to Marie Antoinette. And in terms of association, books with great association and festivities, which is a theme that Ferdinand was very keen on, we have this incredible volume, which includes 139 leaves of drawings in color in 118 characters for costumes and set designs for the great Ballet Royal de la Nuit, which was performed in 1653 by the young king, Louis XIV, at age 14. And the costume on the right is one of the ones that he wore. He danced as 4 different characters: Time, Gambling, Fury, and the Rising Sun. And this ballet was performed over the course of 12 hours over the evening in 4 parts. And there were 3 ballets within the ballet itself. And the end is quite amazing because Louis XIV, it goes into a kind of state of chaos. And as the sun rises, Louis XIV appears as the sun and brings kind of order and peace to this chaos. The book is also bound with a printed libretto of the ballet. And the arms on the cover are of Islin, Louis Treslon-Cochon Islin, who was involved in the organization of the ballet. And the drawings are attributed to Henri Gisset. The book's been completely digitized and it's available on our website. And there was also a publication with which includes a facsimile and essays as well. Another sort of association dedication copy is this wonderful volume of Duperron's Discours sur la peinture et sur l'architecture, which was published in Paris in 1758, with obviously the arms of Madame de Pompadour on the cover, and this wonderful plaquette binding by Dubuisson that he also incorporates the towers from her arms within the plaquette. You can see the individual tools there. And this copy includes 2 full-page drawings by Gabriel de Saint-Aubin. The first is a dedication to the Marquis de Marigny, who is the brother of Madame de Pompadour and Surintendant and Director General of the Bâtiment du Roi. And then also this lovely drawing here on the right, where you can see the interior of the Salon of 1757 with people admiring a portrait of Madame de Pompadour by Boucher. So not only would this book have appealed to Ferdinand, obviously for the Madame de Pompadour provenance, but also Ferdinand owned this particular painting by Boucher in his London house, not at Waddesdon. It then was passed down to Alice and is now in Munich. There's not much known about Duperron, but we know that Duperron and Saint-Aubin both taught at Blondel's École des Arts in Paris. So that's probably where the connection was made. And oh, sorry, I should have shown you before when I was talking about the portrait. There's a view of the portrait on the right and the detail from the illustration. Another association dedication copy is Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, printed 1812. And here on the, you can see for the first edition with this lovely inscription from Byron to his sister, his half-sister, Augusta, which says, sorry, I'm missing the, it says, "To Augusta, my dearest sister and my best friend, who has ever loved me much more than I deserved. This volume is presented by her father's son and most affectionate brother, Byron," dated March 14th, 1812. We know from his letters, Ferdinand is reading Byron, and also he mentions in his reminiscences that some of the paintings at Manor, the neighboring Rothschild property, had pictures from the Manfrini collection at Venice, which he says are mentioned in Byron's Childe Harold. So there's nice associations there, as well as this lovely personal dedication. Another substantial aspect of the collections are the many albums and series of prints bound in mostly large folio. A lot of them haven't yet been catalogued, so there's still properly catalogued. There's still work to do for the individual cataloging of those prints. There's also drawings, so recueil de dessins divers, portraits, volumes of drawings by Claude Louis Deret, for example, and these trade cards. There's book plates and prints from the French Revolution. The book plates, thankfully, were all catalogued with a project in association with the University of Warwick, and they're all available on our website. And I just wanted to highlight some of the ones that relate to the book trade, book and print trade. Here on the left, you've got a trade card of De Hanzy, bookseller in Paris from around 1720 to 1750. On the right, you've got the trade card of Crépy, engraver, print seller, and publisher at Saint-Pierre. And it's either Etienne Louis Crépy, who specialized in geographic material, which might make sense with what's on the trade card here, or his son Jean-Baptiste, who both operated from the same address. On the left here, you've got the trade card of André Gattet, who's an engraver in Lyon around 1710. And it says that he also engraves instruments for bookbinders within the text there. And then on the right, you've got the trade card for Pierre Vente, a bookbinder and gilder of books for the Menu Plaisir of the Chambre du Roi, by Moreau from around 1753. So there's a lot more that relate to the book trade, but I've just shown you a couple of highlights here. Despite not having a book plate himself or a book label, Ferdinand collected 2 volumes of book plates. Here we have a collection of 150, 61 are English with 90 French ones, in this wonderful remboitage binding, which belonged to a series of motets for the Royal Chapel at Versailles. And the volume covers, and on the right you have, I'm just showing you one of the book plates, which is for Madame Victoire's library, one of the daughters of Louis XV. So these haven't yet been individually cataloged, so there's more work to do with that as well. In terms of the graphic arts, there's a lot in the collection. Here I wanted to show you an English example of Wilton Gardens with plates after Isaac de Caus, and of course this is 1640, so a really important early record of early English garden design. And there's very few of these copies are recorded, with 2 facsimile editions published in 1895 and 1892. And there's an Italian inscription here, possibly relating to the engraver Giovanni Volpato, so suggests that the volume made its way to Italy before coming back to England. So there's one of our beautiful volumes. And then, of course, we've got Jean de La Fontaine's Fables Choisies in this wonderful deluxe 4 volumes, Paris, Dessin, Sailly, Jean Bert, between 1755 and 1759, with incredible plates after drawings by Jean-Baptiste Audry, retouched by Cochin, and engraved by 49 different artists, with this wonderful naturalistic settings and beautiful animated animals, and also wonderful woodcuts designed by Bachelier as well. And the bindings are incredible, ascribed to Louis Douceur, with there are 27 specially made tools for the binding that relate to animals featured in the fables. So I just wanted to show you a detail from those. Okay, moving on. Also, just another relating it to the collection. In the room adjacent to the morning room, we have this wonderful chest of drawers from 1756 to 1770, with the side panels are inspired by the illustrations from this Audry edition of the Fables, and the front is also after a painting by Audry. So there's a nice connection, again, Ferdinand had it quite near his books, so would have enjoyed that. Finally, I just want to end with the graphic arts, with these 3 volumes. Of course, the Freudenberg and Moreau, Le Jeune, Suite d'Estampes pour servir à l'histoire des mœurs et du costume des François dans le XVIIIe siècle. These 3 volumes published between 1775 to 1783 are these wonderful evocative kind of fashion plates set with a sort of narrative, and within beautiful interiors show kind of the height of luxury in the end of the 18th century, of course. These 3 volumes have this quite complicated history in terms of the printing history, but the volumes themselves, the bindings we have here, have the stamp for the King of Poland, Stanislav II. And in the catalog entry, Nicholas Pickroad gives a wonderful description and states that the first 2 volumes, the bindings were actually portfolios, and the prints were all loosely kept. And then when the 3rd volume came out, was published, then the 3 were made into book bindings. So there's much more in the catalog entry for those. This, of course, Ferdinand had quite a lot relating to fashion and costumes and hairstyles also in particular. So this would have been very interesting acquisition for him, and also the interiors obviously relating quite nicely to what he fashioned for himself at Waddesdon. Edmond and Alice were two Rothschilds who also owned the preparatory drawings by Moreau le Jeune, which are of an amazing finish. And here we have one on the left, which is La Petite Loge from 1777. And on the right here is her red sitting room at Waddesdon, a picture taken around 1910. And you can see this drawing framed just on the left side above that table where above the ceramic monkey. And you can just about make it out. So there's, again, lovely connections between the collections and seeing Alice collecting this material relating to book illustrations. So now that brings me to Alice. I just wanted to touch on her a little bit. Alice was the youngest sister of Ferdinand. By the 1860s, she was spending more time in England with her brother and other members of her family. And then, of course, when Evelina died, Evelina being Ferdinand's wife, Alice was just 19 and then sort of became this lifelong companion for her grieving brother. She entertained alongside Ferdinand and sometimes even on her own at Waddesdon during his lifetime. Alice was the sole inheritor of Waddesdon and its contents, except, of course, for what was bequeathed to the British Museum. Alice herself built up a formidable collection of works of art, filling 3 houses, Ethrop on the neighboring estate, townhouse of Piccadilly, 142 Piccadilly, and her Villa Victoria in Grasse. There's no evidence that Alice was much of a book collector, although her probate inventory of 1922 of Waddesdon and Ethrop, the inventories for other properties don't survive, lists 11 18th and 19th century books at Ethrop, along with an unidentified 66 modern books. These 11 books were never bequeathed to the National Trust, but some of them are now back on loan to Waddesdon via Lord Rothschild, who'd inherited them. For example, we have here the wonderful volume describing in great detail the creation and installation of Bouchardon's equestrian statue of Louis XV in Paris, written by Pierre-Jean Mariette, published in 1772. So this is one that's now on long-term loan, essentially at Waddesdon. Also, according to her will, she left her great friend and companion, Miss Clarissa Watkins, all books, traveling bags, and any small articles in my Waddesdon bedroom she may fancy. And I've yet to find many books at Waddesdon which have a clear Alice provenance, but I'm sure that some of the 19th century collection of books in the bachelor's wing and also in the small library probably relate to her. There is this lovely inscription for this, oh gosh, my German pronunciation is going to be horrible, so please excuse me, but the Morgan and Duncan Eine Frau from 1862, which is a book written by the Swiss educator and writer Josephine Schender-Stadlin, which deals with questions of moral and religious life. It was very popular and published in 3 editions, this being the last one in 1862. And there's this lovely inscription dated from 1867 to my dear Alice. And Alice would have been about 19 or 20 at the time. She did make a major contribution to Waddesdon with this manuscript author's manuscript from Madame de Genlis, her manuscript for Mademoiselle de Lafayette from 1812. It's 121 leaves in this 19th century portfolio. It also has this wonderful miniature portrait of Madame de Genlis on the front of the portfolio. And then this is what the pages look like inside. A note in the hand of Miss Alice records the manuscript was given to the Comte Kosakowski, who is a grand ami de Madame de Genlis, pour laquelle il a conservé un culte pieux jusqu'à la fin de ses jours. Elle lui a offert le manuscrit et sa miniature en guise de souvenir. And this watercolor relates to another one of Madame de Genlis's works, and it has an inscription in her hand on the back. Her probate inventory of 1922 for Waddesdon lists books in great detail compared to Ferdinand. So there's a list of books of national interest bearing the arms of famous personages or recorded copies from notable collections and a few other more or less unique items. And then there's a secondary list, which is obviously not as detailed, of books included in the various rooms, and also it gives a description of all the books that are found on tables and stands, which is very evocative of the experience that one might have had there. So in the morning room, for example, you find Irigo's Views of Paris, or the Oeuvres of Messonnier and Oppenauer, and the Recueil Julien of Watteau are all on the tables in the morning room. We know that Alice added to the collections at Waddesdon more generally, and most significantly in the bachelor's wing, where she had to fill the empty spaces left behind from the Waddesdon bequest to the British Museum, which was of some 300 late medieval and Renaissance objects, and of course the 14 manuscripts that made up the Renaissance Museum. She filled the spaces with similar objects such as Majolica enamels, textiles, and paintings. And interestingly, she chose to display 22 of Ferdinand's mosaic bindings in the smoking room, which are described as the following are in Morocco with mosaic inlays by Padeloup, Monnier, etc. So Alice didn't have any children, and so she chose James de Rothschild, her great-nephew, son of Baron Edmond de Rothschild, her favorite niece and childhood companion, Adelaide, as her heir. James was born in Paris in 1878, and his father was Edmond, who of course is one of the greatest Rothschild collectors, whose collection of manuscripts de Hamel describes as very possibly the greatest ever assembled by one man. And his grandfather, James, of course, also a great collector. Our James here was more interested in politics and horse racing than collecting, but he studied at Cambridge and settled in England, and then married Dorothy Pinto, who you can see here in 1913. In 1934, here's an image of his grandfather James on the left, and then Edmond and Adelaide, his parents, on the right. In 1934 and 35, both of James's parents died within a year of each other. Their collection was divided between their 3 children. Among the works of art inherited by James and Dorothy were 26 illuminated manuscripts from the 14th to the 16th century, as well as a number of 17th and 18th century manuscripts and other 18th and 19th century books, not to mention the thousands, hundreds of drawings of dessins d'ornement that are now also at Waddesdon. Here, I just give you a sample of one of the incredible manuscripts that was inherited by James. And it's a Book of Hours by Jean Bourdichon with marginal decorations by Master of Claude, Queen of France, from around 1520. On the left, you've got Saint Mark there, and then on the right, this wonderful, realistic, the beautiful flowers and insects on the gold ground. The earliest provenance for this manuscript is from the late 18th century, and it was owned by Renoir. Edmond inherited from his father, Baron James, before it was passed down to our James. So within the 18th century manuscripts that are now kind of settled into the morning room in amongst Ferdinand's books, we have this manuscript, which is the geography homework of the Comte de Provence when he was just 11 years old, so the future Louis XVIII, in a contemporary French binding. The names, the maps themselves are done at quite a high finish, but the names of the seas, provinces, rivers, and towns are all in a sort of childish hand. So we could assume that is the hand of the Comte de Provence. And there's again a lovely association because we have the writing table, a desk that was owned by the Comte de Provence that's in the morning room now, that was collected by Ferdinand by the cabinet maker Riesner. James and Dorothy began negotiations with the National Trust in 1946, which eventually led to the bequest of the Manor and its collections of national importance in 1957, when James died. With this arrangement, with the arrangement that Dorothy would manage Waddesdon on behalf of the National Trust. And here's a lovely image, a beautiful photograph of Dorothy in the morning room. She began preparations for opening to the public almost straight away, which included many weeks spent in the morning room sorting out the books, which she records in her diaries. Barbara records that James and Dorothy also added an additional 9 rare books to the collection. But of these 9, I was able to match 5 of the titles to ones listed within the probate inventory secondary list for books that were on tables and stands. But of the 3 titles not found in the earlier probate, we have the catalogue of books of the Comte d'Oymes catalogue from 1738. And this copy, as you can see, has annotations of the price realized, the prices realized in the sale of April 1738 from his collection, as well as a few other notes about various books. 9 of the lots are now at Waddesdon that came from this collection. And we can see through some of the evidence on the book itself that it was passed through various hands of book dealers. So you have the erased stock numbers of E.P. Goldschmidt, and then Beryl Garnett, and then Barnard Quaritch around 1945. So it would have come to James and Dorothy at some point after that. In the bachelor's wing, the apartments, we find a number of books from Baron Edmond and Adelaide's contemporary book collection, including volumes with a stamp from their yacht, the Atma, which you can see on the right, and other dedication copies. I also recently came across 4 volumes of Josephus' Histoire de la guerre des Juifs contre les Romains from 1701-1703, Brussels, bound in the late 19th century with the Rothschild arms on each covers. One of the volumes has an inscription on the flyleaf, which you can see at the top right there, that says « Donné à Edmond par son affectionné père le 27 mai 1858, jour de son initiation religieuse ». So it would have been given to him by his father for his bar mitzvah when he was 13 years old. These volumes were then seized by the Nazis, and we find the ER numbers and the PS numbers recorded on the flyleaf. Thousands of books that belonged to the French Rothschilds were, of course, seized by the Nazis, many of which were restituted, but a large number were also destroyed or lost. This particular book is included on a list which appears to have been drawn up by Mag's brothers of the books held in the Garde-Meuble de Chenu, Paris, between 1947 and 1949 that belonged to the Succession Edmond de Rothschild, so books that hadn't yet been divided up among his children. And finally, with James and Dorothy, I just wanted to point out, within the shelves in Bachelor's Wing, we also find a number of books with English Rothschild provenances with various Tring book plates, which you can see here, and also Baron James de Rothschild, so the father of Edmond. And excitingly, James A. de Rothschild, a Waddesdon book plate, which is on a number of books here, just in the middle. So with no direct heirs, Dorothy chose Nathaniel Charles Jacob Lord Rothschild and his wife Serena Mary Dunn to inherit the Eathrop and Waddesdon estates, along with the family interest in managing Waddesdon Manor on behalf of the National Trust. Lord Rothschild, son of Victor, 3rd Lord Rothschild, and Barbara Hutchinson, is from the English branch of the family. Lord Rothschild has a great interest in the arts and is an established collector, and Waddesdon has benefited from his acquisitions as well as those made by the Rothschild Foundation under his leadership. As I mentioned earlier, he's inherited a number of books and works of art which have a Waddesdon provenance but did not get left to National Trust. And many of these books are now on long-term loan to Waddesdon, where we keep them in our academic library, which was created by Lord Rothschild in 2001-2002. And you can see it here, a photograph of him sitting within the academic library, which is within our office space for the curatorial department. Lord Rothschild has also generously lent a number of we also have a number of loans from his personal collection that have no Waddesdon provenance, such as this late 17th century or early 18th century album of prints by Jean Lepôtre, containing some 997 prints. One page I found has a watermark which is associated with a number of books and documents from the late 17th century. And I've not yet managed to trace the provenance of this album, but there's a possibility it was acquired by Lord Rothschild at Colnaghi at some point in the last kind of 40 years. Lord Rothschild has also generously lent us a number of books which were given to him by his great friend, the late Mrs. Wrightsman. And these include, there's her book plate on the bottom right, which is quite sweet. And of course, these include one of their most recent loans, which is this manuscript petition by Gabriel de Saint-Aubin from 1775 in a binding with the royal arms of Marie Antoinette. There you can see on the left. This 22-page volume is a plea for a promotion by an army officer, Edmé Louis Desbains. Desbains claimed that the king's grandfather, Louis XV, had promised him the rank of lieutenant colonel 5 years earlier in 1770. The promotion never happened, so Desbains commissioned Saint-Aubin to produce 2 petitions splendid enough to grab the attention of the queen and then of the king. The petition, the first part, which is a petition to Marie Antoinette, praises her virtue, compassion, and patronage of the arts. Desbains presents himself as a loyal servant to the crown and a loving father, seeking a promotion to ensure his family's well-being. While the second part, addressed to Louis XVI, appeals to the king's sense of justice and piety and cites letters from important government ministers in support of his claim. You can see here on the right the title page, which shows Desbains himself presenting his petition to the Queen. He does get the promotion, but it took a total, of 9 years. Waddesdon, as we've seen with the Madame du Pompadour, Duperron discours volume, that Waddesdon has several other examples of Saint-Aubin's book illustrations, including also his earliest independent commission of drawings for a manuscript of Guillot's Mémoire sur la Réformation de la Police en France. So I wanted to finish, and thank you very much for staying with me, showing you a slide of just a few of the displays that we've done at Waddesdon to try and bring the collection out of the bookshelves and to light. So on the left, at Lord Rothschild's request, in 2019, when Mrs. Wrightsman passed away, I put together a very small display there of some of the gifts that she'd given, including mainly books. And then to the top right, we have an exhibition that was curated by my predecessor, Christina Petri, in 2010. And then on the bottom right, there's a photograph from the Festival Books exhibition in 2014. So there's just, we try and keep the books alive and bring them out as much as possible. And thank you so much for staying with me for that whistle-stop tour through the collection and meeting some of the figures along the way. There's a lot more to say, but I had to cut. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing so we can, there we go.
Rachel, thank you so much. You won't hear all the virtual clapping that's going on, but it's absolutely fascinating. What a tour. So wonderful to learn about this collection, or rather collections, and not just their highlights, but also these lesser known items. Thank you.